Hello and welcome to the February 2024 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest this month is Eric Alterman, who has a piece in this month's paper entitled Biden's Lonely Stance on the War in Gaza. Before we get on to the interview, just a quick reminder that all previous episodes of this podcast are available on the website at mondediplo.com, and you can subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts, so that you never miss another episode. Eric Alterman is CUNY Distinguished Professor of English at Brooklyn College and author most recently of We Are Not One, A History of America's Fight Over Israel, published by Basic Books in 2022. America's fight over Israel is clearly ongoing. Biden has positioned himself as Israel's best friend in the fight. In doing so, he's out of step with two-thirds of Americans who back a ceasefire. 70% of voters under 24 say they disapprove of Biden's handling of the war, and a significant number of Jews are in this camp, Eric writes, especially young Jews. Nor has Biden's support secured influence over Netanyahu, who once described the US as a thing that can be easily moved in the right direction. They will not bother us, he predicted. Biden's support for Israel could exact a political price come November. So when I spoke to Eric on the 2nd of February, I began by asking him to tell me more about that support.
Well, Joe Biden has, like many Americans, Jewish or not, he has a long-standing commitment to Israel, emotionally speaking. The typical story that most people Joe Biden's age, and my age as well, grew up with, was of heroic Israel out of the quote-unquote ashes of the Holocaust, making the desert bloom. The Palestinians and Nakba were not really part of this story. The Arabs were understood to be refusing to accept Israel in their midst, and the refugees were nothing but refugees, not a nation. And that story's changed over time somewhat. And people have become sensitive to the Palestinian narrative, but there's two ways of saying the same thing. Amos Oz, the Israeli novelist and peacenik, and Edward Said, the Palestinian exile and Columbia professor, both basically said the same thing. Edward Said called the Palestinians victims of victims. Edward Said used the metaphor of a man jumping out of a burning building and landing on top of another man. Now, in the American discourse, the Israeli victimhood, the Jewish victimhood of the Holocaust has always taken precedence. And in the rest of the world, over time, the Palestinian victimhood has taken precedence. And you can see some of these tensions in the Democratic Party today. But Biden is definitely in the first camp.
And you say, I think, that the attitude of young Americans has changed significantly. So if you sort of posit that view as Biden's view and the generation that grew up at the same time as him, there's a very marked difference between that view and the view of people on the college campuses and people in their 20s and 30s in the States, whether they are Jewish or not.
Yeah, well, I think I'm a historian. At least I think of myself as a historian. And I don't like to predict the future. But I'd say it's a good bet that Joe Biden is the last Democratic American president who will view the conflict the way he does, almost 100% from the perspective of Israel. When in the 2020 Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who came in second and third respectively to Biden, said that the United States should start conditioning its aid to Israel on Israel's human rights record and treatment of the Palestinians. And Biden said, that's just crazy. I can't believe anybody would do that. And he's not doing it now, even though a lot of people are calling for it, including Bernie Sanders and I suppose Elizabeth Warren. But in the future, that won't be verboten for Democrats. It will be for Republicans. Republicans won't. Republicans are, their narrative has been taken over by the evangelicals, who see Israel as an important part of God's plan to institute the book of Revelation, which there's really no talking to them about that.
You make the point in your piece that they are significantly more numerous, those right-wing evangelical voters, than the Jewish American lobby.
Yes, the largest pro-Israel organization in America is Christians United for Israel, run by a guy who thinks that Hitler was sent by God as a warrior to get the Jews to go all in on Israel rather than live in a diaspora.
So we're talking in the first week of February, Eric, and a few days ago, Biden announced an executive order whereby he took some sanctions against a small number of Israeli settlers. In what terms should we see this? Is this tokenism? Is this thinking about the American, the Arab American electorate? Is it a sign that something is beginning to shift a little bit, or is it simply the least he could do in order to signal that he wasn't entirely oblivious to the fact that he is, let's say, out of step with quite a large part of his potential voters come November?
Well, I would say there's no reason it can't be all of those things. First of all, Biden, like virtually everyone in the American government, is really sick and annoyed with Bibi Netanyahu and the contempt that Bibi Netanyahu has shown both for Biden and for the U.S. government since this right-wing government was elected, but definitely since October 7th and the war in Gaza. So Biden has been looking for some way to show this, and this was a good way because these settlers who are acting lawlessly against in the West Bank there's no sympathy at all for them in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has changed quite a bit in recent years and is now the members of the party, the people who are activists, are more sympathetic to Palestinians than to Israelis. It's still pretty close, though. It's still pretty even. As I said, Republicans are 100% behind Israel. So in the Democratic Party, there's a split. There's a sympathy for both sides, depending on where you look. But there's no sympathy in the Democratic Party for the settlers, particularly the violent settlers. So Biden wasn't risking anything in his own party with this. He has, however, been risking quite a lot, not because there's very many voters who are going to be voting on Palestine. Some young people will stay home because of it. And some Arab Americans in the state of Michigan, where Biden did this, will stay home for it. I can't believe they would be dumb enough to vote for Donald Trump, who's much worse on all of these issues than Biden is from that perspective. But what's happening is that the left in the United States, the left of liberals, has adopted Gaza and Palestine as its sort of signature issue, in much in the way that it adopted Vietnam half a century ago. And they're disrupting Biden's campaign, and they're making a lot of noise, and they're alienating a lot of people. You know, they shut down traffic, and they have demonstrations that are distasteful, and they scream at Jews on campus. And that's a problem. That's a political problem. The numbers are not the problem. The image is the problem.
I mean, if we leave the Republicans, the evangelicals out of the account, if Biden were seeking to do what is in tune with the views of Democratic voters and the undecided, would he be calling for a ceasefire? Is that where the center of gravity is in that sort of broad swathe of non-Republican voting diehard Americans?
I would say yes. Most Americans would support a ceasefire now. Most Americans, look, like any decent person, Americans who pay attention were horrified by October 7th and could not see, even however bad, however much you think Israel's occupation and treatment of Palestinians is unjustified. It did not justify the mass murder of civilians, shooting up people at a rock concert. But Israel's response has, as I knew it would, and it wrote that it would, has alienated those people, most of those people. there's one group of people in the United States, very well represented in the media, who say every single person who's been killed in Gaza, which is now more than one out of every 100 people in Gaza, is the fault of Hamas. There's nothing that Israel can do besides getting rid of Hamas, given how Hamas behaved towards Israel and behaves towards Israel. But most people don't feel that way. Most people say, my God, killing all these people over this attack in order to destroy Hamas, when you can't destroy Hamas. It's impossible to destroy Hamas. That's not cool. And it's costing the United States a lot of support in the rest of the world, support that it had earned by virtue of its support for Ukraine against Russia. And there doesn't seem to be any end to it. And Israel's government is not a government that we respect or admire or can trust. So I would say that position, the one I've just described, is the center of gravity in the United States, and certainly in the Democratic Party. Biden is out of step with that. He's trying to get closer to it. He would like to, but he's got a lot of things in his way.
You said that Gaza probably isn't a voting issue for a large number of people in the States, apart from perhaps, young student activists. But you say in the piece that nonetheless, the issue could cost Biden the election. So is that just because the way that this election is so finely balanced and so hard to call, that if Biden loses even a small number of votes to abstentions, it could just be enough to tip the balance in what is already a very difficult fight?
Well, Biden already has a problem with third-party candidates taking away from the anti-Trump vote. But in order to win the election, Biden needs Trump to be his opponent. And he needs the election to be about Trump, not about Biden. Biden doesn't excite enthusiasm really among anyone, which, by the way, I think is unfair because I think he's been a surprisingly effective president from the point of view of American liberals. But in any case, that's the way it is. So you've got these other candidates, particularly Cornel West, who's a very well-known, much admired left-wing firebrand intellectual who is 100% behind the Palestinians and always has been. And African Americans and college students and graduate students and leftists can vote for Cornel West instead of Biden and not support Trump and feel like they're supporting the Palestinians. And that those votes could cost Biden the election the same way that Jill Stein on the Green Party cost Hillary Clinton the election. The numbers are really tight. If Trump gets indicted, if Trump gets found guilty, that could change. A lot of people, I think, would be reluctant to vote for a guy who's going to be in jail. I think that. I don't know it. But it's very possible that these people, in addition to which, people don't like the left wing of the Democratic Party in America, by and large. They equate them with the far right, the racist, anti-Semitic, crazy people on the far right. And the more noise they make, the more that the right is able to associate the Democratic Party with its far left, the less popular it is. Every night I watch the TV show Jeopardy. It's the only television show on network television I watch. And there's a special election going on in Queens and Long Island in New York, which is very close, the election to replace George Santos. And I see these commercials about the Democratic candidate, which are all about the left of the Democratic Party. And the Democratic candidate, whose name is Tom Suozzi, who's a former congressman, he is disassociating himself from the Democratic Party, in part in large measure, because of the immigration issue. So I think that, in order to run successfully, as Biden did in 2020, you've got to run in the center as a Democrat. And to the degree that the Republicans can succeed in associating the Democrats with the Palestinians, that's not healthy for them, on the one hand. On the other hand, you need people who are passionate about the Palestinians to come out and vote for you. It's a tough nut to crack from a purely political standpoint.
And we know that Trump, in his presidency, was a staunch supporter of Israel. Do we have any coherent sense of what his position on the war in Gaza is? I was looking before this interview, and it's actually quite difficult to get a grasp of exactly what his stance is, because it does seem to be rather hard to read.
Trump's position on Israel is by and large determined, A, by Republican contributors. He took a $20 million straightforward bribe from the late Sheldon Adelson to promise to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, which he did, and by Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, who's an Orthodox Jew and a supporter of the settlers. So Trump would never have done what Biden did yesterday in terms of sanctioning settlers. And he'll basically do whatever Israel wants. He also cares about the investments from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states a bit, also because Jared gets billions of dollars from them, and Trump needs their money too from a personal standpoint. Trump doesn't really believe in anything at all, except what helps him personally as he sees it in a very short-term way. So the people who care about Palestinians are not people that were ever going to vote for Trump in the first place. So he has no reason to care about them. He doesn't think about them. He has no policies per se. He's not paying attention to Gaza. He doesn't care how many people Israel killed. He admires illiberal autocratic leaders like Netanyahu. So it's not really an issue for him. It doesn't even come up.
That makes it sound as though whoever wins in November, Netanyahu doesn't have too much to worry about from the point of view of American support. Is that putting it too crudely?
No, I would say that Biden's patience will run out, has run out, and they are looking for what they're threading the needle now. I haven't spoken yet about AIPAC and how much money it raises and how much money it plans to spend in support of the most extreme pro-Israel candidates. And that's a factor that Biden has to keep in mind. They're funding Republicans now, at least as much as they're funding Democrats. They're only funding Democrats to defeat left-wing Democrats. So in between now and the election, Biden has this very narrow thread with regard to Netanyahu. I'm sure that Biden would love it if the Israelis would take out Netanyahu for him and elect a different government. He was very happy with the previous government, which was very right-wing and very tough on the Palestinians, but it wasn't Netanyahu. And didn't have this extremist group in the government. So hopefully by the next time we have the next election, the Israelis will have a new government and Netanyahu will be out. And then Biden will be able to work with Israel. But if Netanyahu stays there, there's going to be a lot of friction and a lot of attempts on the part of the United States to force Netanyahu to do things he doesn't want to do. And Netanyahu will push back, and it'll be a mess from the standpoint of democratic politics.
Another way that Gaza is playing into domestic US politics is in the attention that's been turned to anti-Semitism, and in particular the hunt for anti-Semitism on elite campuses. And elite campuses are clearly a flashpoint for all sorts of issues in the culture wars, gender issues and free speech issues, and anti-Semitism is bound up with that. I wondered if you could say a little bit both about whether there is a reality there which is being amplified, we could say exaggerated, and if so, by whom that is being done, and what is that part of? So can you just contextualize it for people outside the US, how you see what is going on?
Well, it's very complicated, and we could do our entire discussion about it and still not do justice to it today. A few things are happening at once. As I said, the left, which is very strong on elite campuses, has made Palestine and Gaza its signature issue. And so it's very noisy. And they have no power. The only power they have is the power of protest. So they use that power in ways that, as someone who supports the Palestinians, as I do, I find very obnoxious. They shut down demonstrations. They shut down speeches. They shut down classes. They make it impossible for people who disagree with them to be heard. And the universities have to deal with this. And some of them equate Israel with Jews and say and do things that are ipso facto anti-Semitic. No question. You can see that in the British Labour Party as well. But what the pro-Israel side is doing is saying all of it is anti-Semitic. The very fact of supporting the Palestinians is anti-Semitic. The head of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, who's really the prime spokesman for American Jewish organizations on this, says the words Palestine will be free are anti-Semitic. They say that the words from the river to the sea are anti-Semitic. If you don't say, by the way, I support Israel's right to exist. However, I have some problems with their issues. You have to say it like that. You're an anti-Semite. And they're trying to enforce this discourse on all college campuses, where, by the way, in terms of non-Orthodox Jews, non-ultra-Orthodox Jews, most American Jews go to college. The vast majority go to college, and their representation on the elite campuses is enormously high, 10, 20, 30 times their position in the population. So for decades now, American Jews whose primary understanding of their identity has been support for Israel as opposed to any religious activity, they go to college and they say, oh my God, the world is not what we thought. Israel is not what we thought. The Palestinians are not what we thought. I'm really shocked. I'm really horrified. And they go home and they tell their parents, by the way, Israel is a racist colonial settler state. It's not what you think it is. Their parents get furious about hearing this. Their grandparents get furious. They go to the colleges and they say, what are you teaching my children? And the colleges have to respond because these are the people, not only they're both their funders and also the people who are sending their children to their schools. So it's a big mess. Nobody is behaving well on this. And so now anti-Semitism has become a crucial issue that all elite colleges have to deal with. The ones that are dealing with it best are the ones who say, well, Islamophobia is also a big problem, and Arab students are being attacked and discriminated against too. And we want everyone to be comfortable here. So we're going to look into ways to make everyone comfortable. That's what my university, CUNY, is doing. That's what Harvard announced it's doing. I have an article about that in The Nation, and it just went up this morning, the morning that we're talking. But the fact is, again, Arab Americans and Palestinians have very little power at the top of this fight, in where the universities are making their decisions. They only have power at the bottom to make trouble for people, and so they do that. And it's not a very constructive situation. Now, to give you an example, I was on a panel at my college, Brooklyn College, about October 7th with two other professors, both of whom were Jews. And it was originally designed to help students understand why Jews are so attached to Israel, American Jews. And I've written this book recently that I help to explain it. It's called We Are Not One. It's a great book. Everybody should buy it. And what happened is that half of the audience was from this organization that is the most popular organization on campus for pro-Palestinians, called Students for Justice in Palestine. They, after the thing began, they stood up, they read a statement denouncing the panel for not representing their views. They hadn't heard the views of the panel. Then they all left en masse and chanted the names of Palestinians who had been killed in Gaza outside the room until the campus security came and broke it up after a while so that we couldn't be heard. I've had other experiences that are similar to this in terms of my views, which are not 100% consistent with their views when I speak on campuses. It doesn't help anyone. It's an emotional expression, which I understand and I get, and maybe I, would have been sympathetic to it when I was in college. But it's a very ugly situation, and nobody really knows what to do about it. And I'm focusing now on the Students for Justice in Palestine, but I could say the same thing about a lot of the pro-Israel funders of places, of these schools who give hundreds of millions of dollars and feel that their money should determine what is taught on campus, which is absolutely outrageous and contrary to the whole idea of higher education and needs to be fought.
I was going to ask you, Eric, if this situation was having a chilling effect on debate, but it doesn't. What you've described doesn't sound like a chilling effect. It sounds like a polarizing effect, an intensifying effect.
Well, that's true, but it is chilling. I have tenure. I can say whatever I want. But for young scholars, they have to be very careful about what they say, because anyone can put the kibosh on your advancement, and jobs are very hard to find. If I were a young scholar, you and I would not be having this conversation. I'm an old man. See the gray? You can't see it. It's there.
So there is the right making this equation between support for Palestine and Palestinians' rights with anti-Semitism and with terrorism. Do you think that is cutting through and having influence? Because you make the point in the piece that violent anti-Semitism is actually exclusively the preserve of the right, but is this rather relentless barrage from the right equating, people on the left on campuses, some of whom, as you say, may behave in ways that are not actually helping their cause. But do you think it's having an effect in the in public perceptions more widely?
Well, the American press, the conservative press, which is almost half the press now, the Murdoch-led press, is 100% on Israel's side and always treats Palestinians as if they're terrorists. All of them are terrorists, particularly in Gaza, where Hamas is in power. The mainstream American press is addicted to both sides of them. So anytime the settlers attack Palestinian or Israel bombs civilians, they say, but on the other hand, Palestinians did this terrible thing. And of course, it's not at all proportionate. Israel doesn't want it to be proportionate. They have a doctrine of disproportionate response, but it's treated as if it's the same thing. And it's the same thing. The organizations that raise money from American Jews and other organizations, a lot of their money is conservative money. So they are also interested in exaggerating the role of the left in order to say that, okay, the right might be killing people, but the left says unpleasant things about Jews. This is a phenomenon that you can see it everywhere in the mainstream U.S. press, and the discourse it's promoted by these extremely well-funded, powerful American Jewish organizations, and it's very hard for people to get the truth of it. You really need to be someone who's dedicated to finding your own sources in order to understand what I just said, and which I said in an article I wrote about this, which is that literally in 2022, which is the last year we have good statistics, every single violent incident of anti-Semitism came from the right, not from the left. Every single one.
I was speaking to Eric Alterman, whose article in this month's paper is entitled Biden's Lonely Stance on the War in Gaza. You can read it at mondediplo.com. And if you're a subscriber, you can also read every edition of the paper going back over 25 years and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of open access content online to entice you to become one. You'll find all previous episodes of this podcast on Le Monde Diplomatique's website, and you can also subscribe on your favourite podcast app to make sure you don't miss future ones. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I'll be back again next month with another interview with one of our contributors. So until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.